Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Michael Bernstein, the University Provost, and I want to welcome all of you here for this special event where John Hennessy will be speaking to you about the Knight-Hennessy Scholars Program. Let me say a few words of welcome and introduction on John's behalf. It's my happy duty to do that. It's a pleasure to welcome our special guest. As all of you know, John was honored last night at the 16th Engineering Ball as a distinguished alumnus of our College of Engineering and Applied Sciences here at Stony Brook. And also, as all of you know, in addition to being one of our favorite sons, John is the President Emeritus of Stanford University and a remarkable pioneer in the field of computer architecture. Now, John told me to be brief, but as he learned last night, I tend to disappoint people when they tell me to do things, so I'll include him in that. Let's say a few words about John. He's best known for 4 decades of academic leadership at Stanford, of course, serving as its 10th president from 2000 to 2016. His commitment to excellence in education and technology has affected literally thousands and thousands of students and computer engineers around the world. John received his PhD in 1977 in computer science here at Stony Brook. He was among the very first classes of graduate students to earn their degrees in what was then the new Department of Computer Science here at Stony Brook. 50 years. It's 50 years now for the department. Since then, of course, the department has risen to the very elite ranks of computer science departments across the country and indeed around the world. John's a native of Huntington here on Long Island. He received his undergraduate degree at Villanova. We saluted his Wildcats last night on their victory on Monday. He then returned home here to Long Island to continue his advanced studies at Stony Brook. Early in his career, as virtually everyone in this room knows, John was instrumental in the development of a new technology known as the reduced instruction set computer, a game changer in the field that radically lowered cost while increasing performance. John founded a startup around this new technology and helped transfer this RISC to the commercial market. During his presidency at Stanford, John cultivated interdisciplinary collaboration across all faculty ranks. He greatly expanded opportunities for multidisciplinary research and learning in an array of special initiatives at Stanford, spanning human health, environmental sustainability, international affairs, and the fine arts. And having benefited from financial aid himself, both at Villanova and here at Stony Brook, John was a passionate advocate for financial aid on behalf of worthy students, striving to make Stanford and sustaining Stanford in being accessible and affordable to the best students of their generations. Today, John is still breaking down barriers, even as he recovers from his tenure as president. And we celebrated that last night at the Engineering Ball. Let me also mention that this year, John was named chair of the board of Alphabet, the parent company of Google, and he has just received the prestigious Alan Turing Award, the virtual Nobel Prize in the computer science field, for pioneering his new approaches to computer architecture. In 2016, John co-founded the program about which you're about to hear, the Knight-Hennessy Scholars Program, which offers full funding to 100 high-achieving students so that they may pursue graduate education at Stanford. The Stony Brook units devoted to external scholarships and fellowships advising provide a powerful support structure for our students here. They've played a role in having John make his presentation today and in sustaining our support for our most worthy and most competitive students. And there's going to be a Q&A session for interested students after this presentation where you can hear from some of the leadership in our external fellowships office and from fellowship advisors. So please join me in welcoming John Hennessy to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you all. I'm going to take my jacket off because I lecture better without a jacket than with one. It's great. So what I'm going to talk about is the journey I've been on since the days when I came to Stony Brook in 1974, and some of the lessons I've learned along the way through that journey. So I, believe it or not, for all the young people in the audience, when I was an undergraduate, there were no computer science majors at any university in the United States. So I started out as a double E, but had actually begun to develop my interest in computing quite early. My high school science fair project was a tic-tac-toe machine built out of surplus relays. I couldn't afford anything more expensive. Tic-tac-toe is not a really complicated game. If you know what you're doing, you never lose. And lots of people don't know what they're doing, so the computer could actually win quite often. It turned out it was sufficient to get me an honorable mention prize in the science fair, but more importantly, it impressed the family of my girlfriend, who then decided that maybe this guy was going to be okay. Some 48 years later, she's still my wife, so that's a good thing. That was a good thing. So I came to Stony Brook. Stony Brook gave me a really interesting opportunity because, as I said last night, I finished my undergraduate degree in 3.5 years and wanted to start on my graduate studies. They admitted me in the middle of the year, and they gave me financial aid, which made it possible for me to begin my graduate studies. My advisor was Dick Heberts. He was then the chair of the department, one of the first chairs of the computer science department. I learned a tremendous amount from him. He not only taught me how to write my first technical paper that we wrote and submitted to a conference together, but also I TA'd for a number of his courses, and that's how I learned how to be a good teacher. So those key valuable lessons that were absolutely crucial early in my career came about here. In my PhD research, I had a marvelous blessing. An adjunct faculty member from Brookhaven walked in with an interesting problem about 6 months into my PhD studies. And at the time, microprocessors were just emerging. And there were, in fact, only 8-bit microprocessors, so they were only 8-bit wise. They had 16-bit words, but they basically implemented everything with an 8-bit data path. So a 16-bit add would have to take multiple cycles through an 8-bit data path. No personal computers, no cell phones were not even a dream yet. They were something that would come in the future. And the primary use of these was, in fact, the same use that Intel had built the first microprocessor for doing control kinds of situations in industrial settings and things. So he brought in a problem of trying to control a bone density scanner that would enable him to examine people for bone density loss because they were working in a potentially radioactive environment, and would detect whether or not they were suffering any long-term bone loss. But of course, you've got to control this process of examining, because otherwise you're going to give extra dosage to the patient, extra X-ray dosage. So it was a complex control problem. The processors were fairly primitive, and we had to come up with a way to make it easy to write the code and to program the machines. So that's the problem I started working on, an applications-oriented language for real-time applications using these microprocessors. I had a co-advisor, Dave Smith, who was then a later chair of the department. He was on the hardware side. Dick Heberts was on the programming language and compiler side. So I got the best of both worlds, combining them together. I loved being a graduate student. It was the happiest days of my life. I felt like I had more money when I was a graduate student than I began as an assistant professor. But maybe that was just expectations. Life was different. I still remember one of the things my wife and I reminisce about is that when I was a graduate student, we had a budget for groceries that was $20 a week. And when we got to $20, when we got near, we would decide, are we going to get generic beer this weekend, or are we going to get ice cream? Never both. So, but it was a great, and this was my first lesson. You know, sometimes interesting possibilities just walk into your life. And this was an interesting possibility to go work on this problem and pilot in the early days. I mean, computer science was still developing as a field. It was still very new. But here was a way to put together a new technology, namely the microprocessor emerging, with working on a classical problem of how do you use that for an interesting application. So I worked on that thesis. Things worked out really well. I got the work done. And then I decided I would go on the job path. I had wanted to be an academic. I had kind of decided when I was going to get my PhD that was my goal, was to be an academic. There were lots of other interesting jobs out there. Lots of people were going to Bell Labs or IBM Watson, go into the research side, but I loved teaching from the beginning. So I kind of concluded that was the path I wanted to be on. I didn't think about interviewing outside the academic side. And I wasn't exactly sure what kind of job offer I would get. So I started accepting. I sent out a whole bunch of applications, and I accepted every single interview I got a request for. That ended up that I ended up going to 14 institutions. The good news about that is by the time I got to number 14, which happened to be Stanford, boy, I had rehearsed that talk really well. I had thought of almost every question you could think of. But it was a great opportunity also to really visit institutions and to learn about what they were doing as computer science was really beginning to grow as a field. So I found it to be an interesting learning experience. I came very close to taking a position at Wisconsin. My wife was a little worried because Wisconsin seemed far north, and she thought there were more cows than people. But then we flew out to California, and I interviewed at Stanford. This is what it looks like today. The weather is just like that today, so it's. But I flew out and interviewed in March, actually, from Stony Brook, and that was a burgeoning but still small computer science department. They were growing computer science both in EE and CS, and the reason was at that time, computer science at Stanford sat in the School of Humanities and Sciences. And the field was growing much faster than that school could devote resources to it. So what happened is they agreed that electrical engineering would start hiring computer scientists and structured a joint laboratory for people really in the systems area. So doing everything from programming languages, compilers, computer architecture, operating systems, and they would be jointly appointed by computer science and electrical engineering. But there was another challenge. So at that time, people who do experimental computer science, which is what I do, had a really hard time getting tenure at Stanford. They had a great algorithms group, probably the best theory group in the country. They had one of the best AI groups in the country. But the systems people were really struggling to figure out how they fit in this equation. On the other hand, they had incredible students and an incredible track record of supporting faculty. So there was a little uncertainty about my going there. It turned out that the year before I went, a graduate from Cornell, also a computer scientist, had taken a position in electrical engineering. And she persuaded me it was going to be okay. When I was doing my interviews, one of my first interviews was with Don Knuth. And I asked him, here as close to a living father of computer science as we have in the discipline. I mean, Turing and the other group are all gone, but he's as close to we have, the inventor of modern algorithms and analysis of algorithms, among other things. So I asked him a really interesting question. I said, Don, how do you get so much done? And he says, I don't watch TV. That was a really good lesson. So I was never a big TV consumer, but thereafter I was an even less TV consumer. But I found out from him, he's told me something else very interesting. He said the thing that made him successful was that he discovered that he loved computing and programming, and that his brain operated in a way that aligned with the way the discipline works. And I think that's true. And I was an okay electrical engineering student. But when I was here at Stony Brook, I was a great computer science student. And everything from theory, Herb Galenter taught me theory, everything from the theory courses to applied math to the hands-on systems courses, I loved them all. And so I concluded, well, my brain's aligned the same as Don Knuth's brain. So maybe I ought to follow what he did. So I did that. So I came out to Stanford. The very first course I taught was a microprocessor lab course early on, and then I started teaching compiler courses and programming language courses after that. So let me say one more thing about this. This is the time, it'll be better on the next slide. This is the time when the so-called VLSI revolution is just beginning and the famous Meade-Conway systems come along. Up until that time, the only people who designed chips worked for companies who built them. So it was Intel and Zilog and National and AMD. But there was no notion that you could design a silicon chip unless you worked for one of these companies. So Meade-Conway came along and said, well, you know, manufacturing a piece of silicon is not the same as designing, and we ought to free it up and let lots of people become designers. I was at Stanford, and we developed a program to start designing chips. My first collaboration in that arena was with a faculty member who shared the office with me by the name of Jim Clark. Jim would go on to found Silicon Graphics, then to found Netscape, and become one of the most successful entrepreneurs. He had a simple vision. We could use this VLSI technology to radically improve the efficiency of computer graphics and make an enormous breakthrough, lowering the cost of high-quality 3D graphics by an order of magnitude, roughly. And I worked on some of that technology. What I actually built for him was a CAD tool that created the microcode that drove his geometry engine. But we'll come back to this. So this linkage turned out to be very important later in my life. Then Jim went out and started a company, started Silicon Graphics. So we started asking ourselves, what should we do next? I need a new project to work on. This one's done. And we started thinking about computers and whether or not the radical change that was occurring, namely computers shrinking from racks of hardware down to single chips, meant we should rethink how they should be designed. And that's all we started with. We didn't know how they should be redesigned, but it struck us from the beginning that it was time to ask the question whether they should be designed differently. There were two other things happening at the same time that drove that. One was we were switching from an era where people still programmed at least microprocessors in assembly language to them programming in high-level languages. And Unix was emerging with the notion of a standard open OS that didn't belong to any one vendor. So we asked the question, should we design computers differently? And to explore that, we actually set up a graduate course, and I grabbed a bunch of students from around the university, and it was purely a brainstorming course. People would come in with ideas, we'd try out different things, but it was clear from the beginning that the way we should think about designing computers should be different. At that time, it was unbelievable things were happening. Intel would announce a new processor, then Zilog would announce a new processor, and they would say, oh, by the way, we added these 3 instructions that do all this incredible thing. But they were instructions that no compiler or high-level language in the world would ever use. So if everybody wrote an assembly language, they might use them. But the age of assembly language was ending, right? OS 360 was written in assembly language, but Unix was written in C. So things were changing on that front as well. So we started what turned out to be the RISC ideas, design computers differently, design them to be targets for compilers, and design them to be implemented efficiently in this new technology. And up until that time, memory was very expensive and logic was comparatively cheap. Once we went to this VLSI era, that ratio flipped. And so it was a good time to rethink how we design computers. So we built a processor chip called MIPS with a team of 4 graduate students built a processor. Out in industry, they were using teams of 100 to 200 to design, and we did it with only 4. Simply that was an insight that there was something new here. But it was really rethinking the entire problem as the technology changes. It's one of the things that makes computer science such a remarkable field. The technology is constantly changing, and you can go back and rethink how problems should be approached in that setting. So we publish our papers. We think, this is such a great idea. We're done. We're good academics. We'll publish our papers. We'll move on. Everybody in industry will embrace this idea, and we'll pick up on our ideas and start using them. And nobody did. In fact, worse than that, there was a project out at a western branch of what was then Digital Equipment Corporation. Some of the people there had collaborated with us on our project. They started on a similar project. They tried to get the project transferred between the West Coast to the main product line on the East Coast, and they couldn't get it to take. So there was a lot of industry skepticism. There was a lot of uncertainty about the ideas, and there was a gigantic not invented here syndrome that was very hard to pierce. So I thought, I'm basically done. What's my job now? We'll publish some more papers. We'll give some more talks. Maybe we can persuade people. And along came one of the early computer pioneers, one of the people who'd been in Digital Equipment Corporation early on, and said, look, if you want this technology to see the light of day, you're going to have to start a company to take it out there. I might be able to find some way to help you with financing, but you're going to have to go do it. So after a lot of discussions, I grabbed my two co-founders, one who had been at IBM and had worked on similar ideas at IBM. And when IBM canceled the project, he decided he wasn't going to go back to IBM, and a colleague who had worked at Motorola, and we started a company that was then called MIPS. We had to craft a vision for the company. It turned out we way underestimated one difficult issue, which is we had to invent new technology. We also had to invent a new business model, because there was no business model for what is now called the fabless semiconductor industry. There was no fabless semiconductor industry. There were no foundries. We had to kind of pilot that business model. So every startup I've been associated with then, I said, you can do either one thing. You can either create a new business model or you can create new technology, but don't try to do both. It costs way too much money, way too much time, very hard. But we did a lot of things well. We hired really great people. They were enthusiastic about working the ideas, so we got some of the best engineers to leave Intel and come work on this project because it had energy, enthusiasm, a new approach. I learned about startup time. So startup time is academic time times 10. Everything gets compressed by a factor of 10. Any decision not made can be fatal because you're under such pressure. You have a limited amount of money from the venture capitalists, and you have to move on that. And if you don't move on it, you're going to lose. Somebody else is going to scoop your ideas. You're going to run out of capital. The company's going to fail. I faced my first real crisis. The company had gotten a customer early on. We committed to that customer to deliver roughly 18 months after the company started to deliver the prototype aboard with this new microprocessor on we were designing. We actually made arrangements to deliver it by December 31st, 1985. So we get it all back from the fab, we get it all working. It's 2 days before Christmas. We find somebody who wanted to go back east for Christmas. We put him on a plane on Christmas Day. He flies back. He shows up at this other company on the day after Christmas, and they're closed for the week between Christmas and New Year's. He slips a note under the door to verify that it was delivered on that day, and that was our first product. The company was growing by leaps and bounds. But we overestimated how fast the company would be able to grow. And we hired too many people. Then we got in a cash crunch. And the company was about 2 weeks away from missing payroll. So we had no alternative. We had about 120 people by then. We had no alternative but to do a layoff. So when you have a startup company and there are 120 people, you know everybody in the company. You're going to have to look those 40 people in the eye and say, sorry, So we made a decision that on Friday afternoon we would give out the pink slips. Friday morning, we would give out the pink slips when people arrived for work. And that we would ask them all to clear out their offices by noon. Sorry, but we blew it, and we have to go forward. And then the CEO came to me and said, and at the TGIF this afternoon, I want you to stand up and tell everybody why this is still going to be a great company. That was a really hard lesson to do. And yet, if you didn't do it, you were going to have a lot more people walk out the door, and things were going to go down the drain. So I had to do that. That was successful. We managed to turn it around. We managed to find some partners eventually to help the company get some more financing. And the company was successful, went public, was a great experience for everybody. I still remember on the day. So we had a rule. Every employee in the company had stock. Every single employee had some stock. And I still remember going in on the day we went public, and the receptionist said, I now have the money to send my son to college. And that was a really great experience. So I spent about 18 months on leave full-time getting MIPS started, and then I was spending a bunch of time consulting and working down there. But I had to decide, was I going to stay in the startup world, or was I going to go back to the university? And in the end, I concluded that I missed working with students. I just missed teaching. I missed advising students in research, working with them on interesting research problems, and that my life really would be happier back in the university. I loved being a startup. It has a sense of intensity and excitement, and everybody's pulling together, a kind of focus. But it doesn't have students, and it doesn't have quite the same freedom. You've got to get a product out. You've got to move. You've got to focus on it. So I decided to go back to the university and spend my time back there. I still continued to be involved in MIPS, but it was down to a day a week and half time during the summer or something. Every summer they would put me on an airplane and fly me around to do lectures to potential customers and things. But it was fun. It was a great opportunity. And then I got together with a guy by the name of Dave Patterson, and we started lamenting the quality of textbooks that were being used for computer architecture. And in that time, computer architecture was taught what we sometimes call the supermarket method. Chapter 1, computers from this company. Chapter 2, computers from this company. Chapter 3, computers from this company. Make sure you buy one from Chapter 1, one from Chapter 2, and one from Chapter 3. No attempt to say, what were the principles? How do we compare what one company's doing against the other? And this actually got back to an interesting insight. One of the reasons we had a hard time selling the RISC ideas, both Dave and I, both of us, he worked on the RISC project at Berkeley, I worked on the project at Stanford. One of the reasons we had a hard time selling it to people was while we discovered something, we didn't have a good scientific explanation of what was happening early on. And in the strange way that things sometimes happen in the academic world, we read a paper published by some people at Digital Equipment Corporation, and all of a sudden I realized what was happening, why the RISC ideas were better. Simple reason was you executed 25% more instructions, but you executed them 5, 6, 7 times faster. So even though you had to do more instructions to complete the function of a program, you were doing them so much faster that there was a big gain. But I didn't understand early on why this was really happening. So after Dave and I figured that out, and I wrote a paper about it, I said to him, we can really write a much better textbook than exists out there. And Dave said, well, if we're going to do it, we should do it now, because he was scheduled to become chairman of the computer science department at Berkeley, and he was worried that his life as a researcher was going to be over at that point. Turns out being department chair is not fatal, although I thought the same thing early on. So we started writing the book together. We actually, he was on sabbatical. We would meet at the Deck Western Research Lab, which was in downtown Palo Alto. We would meet down there 1 or 2 days a week. We would exchange stuff. Then we decided we would get an alpha version of the textbook, and we took some poor students and made them use this alpha version of the textbook, which was buggy, lots of notes in it, lots of things not fleshed out. But today, if you use the alpha version of that, you get a little badge of honor because lots of people have subsequently used versions of the book. So we wrote this book together. This is actually a paper this is a picture from the New York Times in 1990 when the book came out and talked about a Stanford-Berkeley collaboration. And I point out that Stanford and Berkeley compete hard in football and sports, but they collaborate in a lot of other things, like all great academic institutions. So we ended up doing an alpha version, a beta version. I'm FedExing a chapter up to him because he says, I have to teach that chapter next week. Could you send me a copy of it so I can send it out? But we got it done, and that was the first version. If you look at the cover or you look at some things about the book, you'll see it's really inspired by Don Knuth's famous series of books on algorithms. We took some of the key ideas about how to structure a book directly out of that. Got back, started some new research projects as well, and really reintegrated myself with academic life at that point. So I had managed to avoid becoming a department chair, both in electrical engineering, or by then my appointment was joint between electrical engineering and computer science, and I had turned it down in both departments, mostly because I wanted to get more research done, and I didn't yet feel like my research had reached the point where I felt I could devote less time to it. But eventually, if you're a good citizen of an academic institution, eventually you have an obligation to step up and serve your fellow colleagues. So I stepped up just as computer science was moving into a new building, the Gates Computer Science Building. And that was the first time that the Stanford Computer Science Department was all in one building since the time it was founded. It had been scattered because it had grown hodgepodge and didn't fit anywhere. And so it was the first time it really could reintegrate, which recreated a whole new dynamic with people collaborating across boundaries in the field. And I think something was really healthy for the department. The other lesson I learned along the way is leadership is really hard. The provost is the worst job at the university. Now that Michael's gone, I can say that. It's a really hard job. Dean's jobs are hard. Even department chairs' jobs are hard. But it's a lot easier to be a department chair than it is to be a dean or to be a provost. So it was a good place for me to start and learn how to do those leadership kinds of things. The most important thing I learned is that leadership is service. When I was thinking about becoming the dean of engineering, I got some advice from the previous dean, and he said to me, look, don't take this job as dean because you like the accoutrements, or you like the title, or you like the slightly higher salary. Take this job because you want to serve your fellow colleagues and the students, and you want to make a better university for them. And that was the best piece of advice I ever got. So I became the dean. It was a terrific job. My wife would say today it was still the best job I ever had. You know, it's a few hundred. Stanford was around 200 faculty then. You could know them all on a first-name basis. You can meet with them all. Engineering is a small enough discipline that you can sort of understand what they're doing, have some understanding. Later on, that doesn't become true anymore when the university gets a lot bigger. But I loved it. I looked for some interesting opportunities to build win-win situations. I tried to engage that network I had built up. By then, I had been at Stanford for 15, 16, 17 years. So I engaged that network. And one person I went back to engage was my good friend Jim Clark. So we'd shared that office. I had helped him start his company up. He had then had not only had Silicon Graphics been successful, but Netscape has been very successful. And we were undertaking a new project to build a new interdisciplinary center focused on the overlap between biomedical and bioengineering and all the other disciplines in the university. So biophysics, bioengineering, biomedical, as a way to really promote interaction and interdisciplinary work across that boundary. Right? Stanford, like Stony Brook, has the great benefit of having a medical school on the same campus. It's one of the terrific things that a lot of universities don't have that. They have them separated. But it allows for, given the importance of the research problems in the biomedical and biosciences sphere, the ability to bridge that gap, to bring engineering and physics and other sciences into play was a great opportunity. So we had a project that some faculty had dreamed up called BioX to do this, but it needed a home. So we got together, I got together with my friend Jim Clark and said, Jim, we have this really great idea that I want to talk to you about, and it's to build this new interdisciplinary thing. I want you to come out, talk to some faculty, see what's going on, hopefully get excited about it. And at the end of the day, I told him, well, I needed $100 million or more to get this going. So Jim did it. Jim made that gift. We built something called the Clark Center, which was a great building right on the junction between the medical center, 2 minutes from computer science, 3 minutes from the hospital, 4 minutes from chemistry, 3 minutes from biology. It could be right in the middle of the things. And it became our new home for really experimenting with how to do interdisciplinary things. So here's a building, 40 faculty, 20 different departments, scattered across campus in collaborative groups around common themes. So a genomics theme, a bioengineering theme that's focused around devices and things, really became the way we structured it. And that was a big success, mostly because we learned how to build interdisciplinary things. Not it was a success in its own research and things, but it also gave us a way to pilot how to build these interdisciplinary collaborations, which was absolutely crucial if we were going to go ahead. So I'm happily being dean. I like the job, and then I'm 2.5 years in, and the provost, who was Condoleezza Rice at the time, decides she's going to step down as provost to go off and get ready for what eventually became the George W. Bush's presidential campaign, and she eventually became his foreign policy advisor during the campaign. So then President Gerhard Casper comes to me and says, I'd like you to be provost. So this is a really hard decision because it pulls you away, really pulls you away from your academic roots. I could still have while I was dean, I had maybe 1 or 2 PhD students at a time. I could teach once in a while. I could still stay plugged in. I knew all the faculty. I could understand at least what a mechanical engineer or a civil engineer was doing. All of a sudden, I was going to be in a position where I couldn't understand what everybody from medical school to the law school to German studies to philosophy to all the sciences were doing. I'd be an amateur at best in trying to understand what they were doing. And I'd have thousands of faculty, 1,500 faculty instead of 200. I was thinking about it over the weekend. So I met Gerhard on a Friday and said, can I think about it over the weekend? Gerhard Casper, the president. And he said, sure. So on that weekend, a remarkable thing happened. You know, there are times when you get a calling that somebody, and in this case, Condi Rice was giving a speech. And it was we have a celebration every year called Founders Day where we celebrate the gift of the Stanfords to the university. And she was giving a speech, and she told a story that's in her book called Ordinary Extraordinary People. That's the story of growing up in her family, about her grandfather. Her grandfather had grown up as a black sharecropper in Alabama, barely eking out a living. Decided if he was going to get his family ahead, he had to go to college. Found a small college in Alabama, saved up enough money to enroll for his first year, and did okay. So then they said, you know, you did well enough. We took a chance on you to letting you in, but you can continue. You just have to pay the tuition for next year. And he said, but that's all my savings was that first year. And they said, well, you have to pay tuition. So then he said, well, what are those white boys over there? They don't have any more money than I do. How are they going to school? And they said, oh, they're going to become ministers, and they get a scholarship. And he said, what if I wanted to be a minister? And that is how the Rice family became Presbyterians, because it was a Presbyterian college, and they became Presbyterians that way, right? Not Baptists, Presbyterians. He went to college. His son finished his Doctor of Divinity and was Condi's father. So she says, that's why I'm so dedicated to education, because this is the transformation that education can create for a family. So I started to talk. I said, you know, the university needs a provost. If we don't have a provost, we don't have a university. And I decided to say yes to the offer to become provost. So I then basically, I loved being provost. I'm an intellectually curious person. I love walking around. I love hearing what faculty are going to do. The good news is when you're provost, you can call up anybody in the faculty and say, I'd love to come over to your lab or your office and hear about your research. Good for them, good for you. Everybody wins. It was a really great. So I did a lot of leadership by walking around, a lot of listening. The biggest danger you have if you're in an academic leadership position is to ever think that you know more than a faculty who's in a discipline that's not yours. Because you don't know more, right? And it's one of the nice things about a university. It makes you humble because you realize that there are people who know a lot more. In fact, there are undergraduates who know more about most fields than you know. And that's good to keep in mind. So I spent a lot of time walking around, learning. I learned some interesting things about empathy. I met some incredible students who had overcome enormous disadvantages in order to get to Stanford. And it really inspired me about the importance of financial aid and supporting these students who really had to overcome gigantic disadvantages to be successful students. So I was a few months into being provost when President Gerhard Casper announces that he's going to step down as president. He was then in his 7th year, and everybody assumed he was going to go 10 years, but he decided that 8 was going to be enough. So after a long search process, they asked me if I would become president, and that was in 2000. So I then set about trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I'm not a storekeeper. I'm not the kind of person who was just going to mind the store and keep everything smooth. I was going to try to do new things. After all, I was still young and energetic, so I set out trying to craft a proactive vision, try to do big things. For us, much of that focused around trying to move the university forward in terms of doing interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, collaborative things. We built a lot of buildings that relied on that. We took advantage of the fact that the university had great strengths, so we could pull people together. The first building we built was one focused on environment and energy, and again, the same model. We had faculty from more than 15 different departments who came together to work on topics around land, water, energy, all the key resource issues. I also started to work really hard on access and affordability. I think we felt at that time that many students were not even considering applying to a place like Stanford because when they saw the tuition, they got sticker shock. They just thought, there's no way I'll ever get enough financial aid. So we decided we needed to craft a financial aid program that was really clear-cut. And that's where we decided that we would just basically say, if your family made less than $100,000 a year, your tuition bill was zero. No questions asked, that's it. Your tuition bill was zero. And if your family made less than $60,000 a year, your room and board bill was also zero. That worked. It got a breakthrough that we weren't able to get, partly because if you've ever seen the FAFSA form, it's 16 pages long. You fill in 16 pages. You do a one-sided tax return, you still fill in all 16 pages. It's one of the stupider things we do in the country. And of course, what happens is kids who are from less well-resourced high schools don't have a guidance counselor who can help them figure out how to fill this form in. Their parents may not be able to do it. So getting this simple financial aid model was absolutely clear to do it. We started thinking about what role did universities have in the world in trying to find solutions for the biggest problems we faced. I became convinced that government had a hard time being the solution creator anymore, that the world had gotten too complex, and that universities had to step up and try and find solutions. You still needed government to implement many things, but that universities would have to craft those. This was a time when the large, long-term research laboratories in the US that were given lots of freedom, the Bell Labs of the world and Xerox PARC and IBM, were kind of losing that ability to do long-term research in the public interest. So I felt universities would have to pick up that burden. How do we then collaborate to create those kinds of opportunities? So we began thinking about that. The other great thing about being president is you get to meet a lot of interesting people along the way. So I got to have President Obama come out twice, one of the smartest guys I've ever met. I did some interviews with Bill Gates, who I'd known over many years. Sandra Day O'Connor was a commencement speaker for us. So I got to meet really interesting people. But the most fascinating person was the Dalai Lama. Here's a person that exudes joy of living and has an incredible sense of humor. So the Dalai Lama comes to visit, and he lives in northern India, in Dharamsala. So he comes to visit. You know, jet lag. He's 12 hours out of cycle. You know, we figure. So we're talking to him before he goes on. He says, and so we say, how much sleep did you get last night? I figure he's dead. He goes, guess. So we say 6 hours, 5 hours, 7 hours. And he goes like this. You just love it. He had such a sense of humor. He's such a wonderful person. It was probably one of the most extraordinary opportunities that I had during that time. So there were lots of good things about being president. There's also crisis. So we had just put that new financial aid program I mentioned in place. We front-loaded the program. In other words, we didn't really have all the money we needed, but we thought we might be able to raise it over time. So we basically extrapolated ahead of the budget, put ourselves out, and then the financial crisis hit just after we had announced the new program. The endowment lost 25%. We lost $5 billion worth of value in the endowment. We have a very large endowment, but we count on that to run the university. It's where almost all our financial aid comes out of endowment. Basically, in a short period of time, we lost $5 billion. That was 25% of the endowment. Created a budget shortfall just by itself, and then we had this new financial aid program. The other thing we hadn't realized was students came in and all of a sudden said, well, last year both my parents were working, now only one is working, and we had to recalculate their financial aid. That alone was an extra $5 million in financial aid for our relatively small undergraduate body of 6,500. So we had to decide what to do. We couldn't just stand still and let air out of the balloon really slowly. It would have taken a long time to recover if we weren't going to do something dramatic. Our calculation was it would have taken us 7 years. We would have had budget cuts 7 years in a row. That just seemed so painful and so demoralizing for everybody. So we sat down and said, we've got to do something big. The first thing we decided is we're not going to touch financial aid because students are the core of the university. We made this commitment to them. That meant we had to lay off staff, basically, many of whom had been at the university for a long time, in order to keep a commitment to students, some of whom were just arriving on campus. But we decided in the end that was core values. Students are the core of the university. We also couldn't fire faculty, but we could freeze all the faculty searches for a period of time at least. We froze all the faculty new hires. We froze salaries. Then the provost and I announced that we were both taking a 10% salary cut, and that really sent the message, this is serious to people. We really need to do something. And we said to everybody, you've got to cut the budget. We're going to let you decide how to cut your budget, but everybody has to cut their budget. And we asked everybody, we made all these announcements in March, and we said by June you have to decide how you're going to fix your budget, and by July you have to have the work done. So it was very non-traditional for an academic setting. And I basically drew on my experience of having to do this in a startup, where you have to do it quickly. Lots of faculty were really concerned about this and didn't want to do this. And they said, well, you know, other universities are not doing that. We're going to be at a disadvantage. But we were sure, and the trustees were completely behind it, behind us to help us do it. So we did it. Turned out we had one painful year, and by the next year we could begin hiring faculty again and begin restoring things and moving forward. So it was a challenging time, but a year later, it was clear we had done this properly and gotten through the worst of it. You get through the tunnel. So this is my view. You go into a dark tunnel, get out as quickly as you can. I had some other great things. Steve Jobs came out and did a commencement speech, which is, in my mind, still the greatest commencement speech of all time. He talks about connecting the dots in his life, but he also talks about facing failure. Remember, this is a guy who founded Apple and then got fired from it and then came back and saved the company. He talks about that, and he concluded by talking about facing cancer. A truly terrific talk. Afterwards, he says, you know, how was that? I wasn't really sure it was a great talk. I said, Steve, don't worry, it was a great talk. The other funny thing about Steve's visit, he says to me, can I wear my Keens and my jeans? I said, yes, you're going to have an academic gown on. You can wear whatever you want. So he did. Oprah, we wanted her to give all the graduating students a new car. We could get a book. We did get a book out of it, but not a car. So I was then in roughly my 14th year as president. We had concluded 2 major fundraising campaigns, and it was time to begin thinking about moving on and giving somebody else, getting a new leadership team and give them a shot at leading the university. So I began thinking about what do I want to do next in my life. And I contemplated a variety of things. I thought, well, maybe I'll just do a little teaching, go on a few more corporate boards and do that. And somebody gave me interesting advice. They said, you're not going to be happy doing that. You're not going to be happy unless you're doing at least one really big thing that's your major focus. So I thought that was pretty good advice, and I started thinking about it, what I might do. This was a time when there were lots of crises that began to show up in the leadership around the world. The refugee crisis in Europe was already underway. The preliminary talks about Brexit were underway. Our election hadn't happened yet, and there was no sign of what was going to happen. But the discussion around Brexit already showed that perhaps we were in a new environment. The Volkswagen difficulties were in their early days. We had just come after the financial crisis in 2008, where I'd say 2007-8, where leadership wasn't everything it could have been, right? And we had earlier cases, whether it was Enron or WorldCom and things like that. I really felt like there was a real gap in the quality of leadership, not just in government setting, but also in the nonprofit world and in the corporate world as well. So I started thinking about what we could do about that problem. And we came up, well, after looking at other things, including the Rhodes Scholarship, Gates Cambridge, and Marshall, and the various other highly selective scholarships around the world, we started to think about whether we should try and build something in California that would embrace the West Coast ethos, what makes Stanford a unique place, its entrepreneurial mindset, interdisciplinary study. And I began to carve out a program like this. Fully endowed, take 100 students a year, pay their courses, create a co-curricular leadership program that would help them develop as better leaders in all careers. So not trying to narrow ourselves to one sort of avenue for leadership, but thinking broadly. We wanted it to be fully endowed because we wanted to build a community of scholars stretching on that would form a network above and beyond their time at Stanford. So that meant it had a big price tag. So I went to Phil Knight, the founder of Nike, and talked to him about the idea. He said, that sounds terrific. I said, Phil, I need $400 million to get started. So he didn't say yes immediately. He said, let me think about it. And a month later, he came back and said, yes, he would give us the first $400 million. With that, we raised another $400 million so we could fully endow the program in perpetuity. And we got it going. The idea really is to help prepare the next generation of leaders in any discipline in the university, so our scholars can be in any one of 125 different graduate programs. And in the first cohort of applicants, more than 90% of the programs had at least one applicant to them. So they were scattered across U.S. as well as international. So we're looking for students both from around the world as well as from the U.S. Because we are building a program that really is a community and will hopefully learn from one another, we're building a home where the program will sit called Denning House. Denning House overlooks what we call a seasonal lake in California. So seasonal lake means big rain year, water. Low rain year, no water. Last year, lots of water. This year, not much. So, but it's a gathering place where we can host seminars, bring people together, drop in for informal tea, have a discussion, have a dinner. Our first dinner this year, actually this upcoming fall, will be with George Shultz, the only living person to serve in more than 2 cabinet positions since the age of FDR. So he's going to come in and talk about everything from working with Ronald Reagan to combating the ozone layer degradation that occurred when he was Secretary of State. We'll have some fellows and residents run special seminars in the program, so really try to build up opportunities for students to interact together. We just picked our first cohort of scholars in February. They come from around the world. 53% were born outside the U.S., and 63% carry a non-U.S. passport. It's a mix, 45% PhD, 37% in professional degrees, and the rest are in MA or MS programs. And they literally come from around the world. I don't think I have the picture here. Let me. So we've got every single continent represented except Antarctica. The Penguins couldn't do the GRE. We just had a real problem with the GRE. The pencil, they have a hard time filling in the little colored circles. No, but a distinguished group. You'll notice one of the interesting things for us is we ended up with a group that's majority women, has 50% more diversity than the graduate population as a whole at Stanford. So we ended up with a group highly diverse, partly because we were looking for people who were motivated to change the world, who were thinking not just about what they could do, but what they could do through their efforts and their career for others. So really, really distinguished group of people. All different walks of life coming in to study various things. By the way, not only is it majority women, the engineering cohort is majority women. The biomedical, biology cohort and PhD is majority women. So it's an interesting, really interesting mix of people. So if that's something that might interest you or you might consider doing it, here are just a quick set of things I'll tell you about this. But let me also, I'm going to introduce Amy DeBose. She's on our staff. She runs our student engagement and community programs, and she'll be across the hall. So if you have follow-up questions in detail, she's the person to ask. She can tell you everything about it. But here's the basic outline. You have to apply two important things. You have to apply both to our program, Knight-Hennessy, and to the department. You have to get admission to whatever department you're applying to in order to be eligible as a Knight-Hennessy Scholar. We cannot force fit you into a department. The department has to be enthusiastic, right? If I force fit you into a department, I won't last very long. So that's a lesson in academic management. And you have to apply within 4 years of finishing your first college degree. So within 4 years of finishing your bachelor's degree, you have to apply. There's a September 12th deadline for that application. And then by November 12th, you have to have your department application completed. And then we notify the finalists in January. We bring all the finalists, this last year it was 103, fly them out for a weekend in January. It's generally a good time to come to California for most people. Fly them out for a weekend in January, which we call Immersion Weekend, which is an experiential weekend. What's it like to be on campus? Provide you some time to go visit your home department that you're applying to. There's an interview as part of that weekend. But it really is get a feel for what it's like to be on campus and have that experience. Then we notify our finalists in the end of February, and they show up in September. Okay, so that's it. That's my journey. That's my new mission in life, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. This was an unbelievable lecture. John mentioned the famous now Steve Jobs commencement speech. And I think most of you should have watched it on YouTube, or maybe some of you were there present. I think you'll agree with me that what we just heard ranks right up there in terms of inspiration, commitment to leadership, service, and sheer passion for educating the next generation of leaders. So this was incredible.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Let us open the floor to questions.
Probably a lot of people are wondering what you're doing in 2020.
Well, as part of the deal, so when you ask somebody for $400 million, if they're a smart businessman, they extract other concessions from you. Namely, I agreed to lead the program for at least through its startup period. In 2020, I'm staying far away from Washington, but hopefully somebody younger than me will come in with a lot of energy. I talked mostly about the things I worked on facing crisis. I didn't talk about I'll tell you what, I'll share my big disappointment with you. I worked incredibly hard to try to get immigration reform to work. I worked hard on the DREAM Act, and I worked hard on high skills visa reform. In about less than a year after President Obama was in office, he came out to a dinner hosted by John Doerr, a famous venture capitalist at Kleiner Perkins, that I was at, along with Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, a very young kid by the name of Mark Zuckerberg, Steve Jobs, who was then reasonably ill but managed to attend, John Chambers, the CEO of Cisco, a number of other, Eric Schmidt, who was then CEO of Google. We all got together about a half an hour before the president came, and we decided we'd pick one thing to focus on, and the one thing was visa reform and immigration reform. And we talked about the importance of the DREAM Act and the importance of high skills visa reform. So we did. We asked Steve to actually take the lead as kind of senior statesman in the group, and he talked about the importance. And I remember, President Obama's a really smart guy, and he said, this is really hard because it's become a political cause in Congress, and each side wants to get something else that it has on its agenda. Even though they might agree with the core, as we've seen. There's general support for the DREAM Act. There's general support for high skills visa reform. But each side tries to attach to it something which the other side views as a poison pill. And so we talked to him, and he said, well, if you really wanted to work on it, if you're willing to dedicate a bunch of your time as the senior leaders for the next 2 years, he says, you probably have a 50-50 chance of getting it through. You tell a group of high-tech CEOs who in 2 years their companies have changed completely, that they could work on it for 2 years and maybe they'd get something. It was really kind of defeating at that point. And that's when I began to think about the crisis we were facing in leadership. Look, the word compromise has become a dirty. We wouldn't have a constitution without the word compromise. So it's about time we got compromises that work well for the country and do the right thing for the people in the country.
It seems that in our parent generation, it was enough to have a high school degree. In our generation, a bachelor. Nowadays, you need at least a master's, but it's getting more and more expensive. If you don't have wealthy parents or you had the opportunities to get all these scholarships, we're not going to be able to educate the billions of people in the world. What's your solution? We don't all have friends with hundreds of billions.
No. I think the problem extends across most of the higher education sector, right? The publics, places like Stony Brook or Berkeley in my backyard at home, both who've seen their budgets under pressure and certainly not growing, either with student demand or with reasonable inflation. And I think the same thing exists in most public institutions now. And many of the privates, those without large endowments, are under similar kinds of pressure. I don't think there's a silver bullet, so I think the academy is going to have to stand up, and my belief is we're going to have to find a way to bend our cost curve. And thinking about how to do that, I've had long discussions with lots of people. I think the answer has to be partly technology. I don't believe technology is a magic wand that's going to solve everything. But I think we could use technology better to begin to bend that cost curve some. And I think if we don't bend the cost curve, we're going to have a continued revolt by American citizenry, which part of what we see now. All of a sudden higher education is the bad guy. Higher education in the U.S., it's one of the things we do better than anybody else. And we ought to continue to invest in that. It's become more important. I think we also haven't done a good job of articulating the economic value. There are studies out there that make it quite clear. And I've given lots of talks, not only to parents, but talks to grandparents. I said to grandparents, the best thing you can do is to invest in your grandchildren's education. It's more important than doing anything else for them because it will buy them more leverage over time. And so we've got to figure out better ways to do this because debt levels can't continue to go up. They can't. They cripple students. They make them choose things that aren't necessarily best for them. So we've got to do that. And partly our part is going to be to bend the cost curve. Then we've got to get the American public to step up and realize the importance. The ground has changed under us in an interesting way. In the 60s and 70s, higher education was viewed as a public good. It's been transported largely into being a private or at least semi-private good. We've got to make sure that we don't completely lose the support because it's in the best interest of the entire community that we support higher education, not just the kids that take advantage of it. So that's something we're going to have to continue to work on. But I think higher ed's going to have to do its piece as well, or we're not going to win that battle. Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's a good question. I think one of the reasons we've suffered from getting a more diverse core into STEM is that many of these kids come from under-resourced districts and don't have the courses. When I went to school, you could still major in engineering without AP Calculus or AP Physics. If you had it, you were good. That was even better. Now, if you've got neither AP Calculus or AP Physics, it's really hard to major in engineering now and keep up with the pace of material and things. And that's largely due to the fact that we do not provide equal opportunity at K-12 for every young person in this country. And in some sense, it's a national disgrace because as a country, every child should have the same opportunity at moving ahead, demonstrating their ability, and having the opportunity then to go to college. So, and if you look at this recent work by Raj Chetty that shows that there are tremendous inequities according to where you grow up. Tremendous. If you look at your ability to move from the lowest income quartile to the highest, it's 6 times higher in San Jose, California, than it is in Atlanta, Georgia. 6 times. So that's something we have to do, and part of that, a big part of that is school systems. It's not the whole solution, but a big part of it is school systems. We've got to invest in young people. And a really bad thing has happened in this country. We created Medicare, and we created Social Security because we did have a problem. We had elderly people who were being driven into bankruptcy by their medical expenses. But if you look at what's happened as a country and the percentage of revenue that now goes to people over 65, it's much larger than the percentage that goes to people under 18. So we're disinvesting in our young people to support our elderly population. We've got to figure out a way to reverse that and move more money and invest in those so that those kids can have the opportunity to have the math and science courses that they need to go into computer science or physics or a pre-MD program or whatever they want to do. That's something we should be doing as a country. I wish the president would talk more about it.
I wanted to go back on the student debt. I work in the world of medical education. Students graduating with $300,000.
Yeah.
They go into fields where there's vastly different learning possibilities. Some are highly different, others can do global health, work in other cities, and do God's work.
Yeah.
Other very important stuff.
Yep.
The answer that I'm working on with some schools now is tying your payment for your education to the earnings that that education provides.
Yeah.
So that the neurosurgeon is going to pay a lot, and the person who's going to enter the clinic
Yeah.
is paying 3% or something.
Yeah.
It takes a big bolus to get that going.
Yeah, it does.
But if you have my question to your people, once they get this wonderful education in the city, do they have an obligation, a real obligation to contribute to the next generation? And the really way to fix that is a contract in which you agree to do 3 to 5% of whatever you earn ever after to build a firm. If you do that, in some models for medicine at least, if you do that for 20 years, you have a program that's not only paying for itself each year, but building on future investment.
Yeah. Yeah, I first of all, I agree with you, medical school debt. It also affects what specialties people go into. We have more plastic surgeons than we need. We've got more people in dermatology. Yes, I know. And it takes too long to get a medical degree, right? That's another problem, and it costs too much money. We need to fix all those things. Medical debt's too high. And it can work. We did one of the experiments we did. I had, you're really shaped by the people you meet. And at one point when I was president, I met a young woman who came from Chicago, very poor background, who had been a Harvard undergrad and wanted to come to a program we have at Stanford that's a teacher education program. That's an intensive 1-year program that prepares teachers, particularly to work in underserved districts. So a lot of mentoring, hands-on, even after they graduate, because the dropout rate, you look at an underserved district, how many teachers drop out, and that's a real problem because they get constant teacher turnover. But she was scared to death because that 1 year would cost her roughly $60,000 with room and board and tuition and everything else. And she's thinking, I'm going to a school district that might pay me $27,000 a year or something in a poor neighborhood. So I found a donor whose mother had been a teacher and was enthusiastic about doing something about keeping people who were committed to low-income districts. So we set up a program whereby you would get loan relief if you stayed for 4 years in a low-income district, working in a low-income district. We would take your loans and wipe them out completely. Yeah, there are lots. Yeah, so you can these models where you get percentage of revenue are starting to emerge, and maybe they'll be the right thing. Of course, what happens in the end is, guess who pays the salary of that neurosurgeon? All of us pay the salary of that neurosurgeon, right? Whether it's through Medicare or it's through hospital, through insurance premiums, we're paying that salary. One of the things I found ironic is if you look at the salary differentials in Finland, for example, between doctors and school teachers, they're not that big. And guess what? Finland has the best school teachers in the world as a result of that. In a capitalistic society like ours, when we set people's salaries, we do send a value message about the importance of that profession. And I think teaching in that sense is the most underpaid profession that exists. And being a professor is a great career. And there's a lot of honor associated with being a professor. That's less so about K-12. But if you go to other parts of the world, being a teacher is a very honored profession. And we need to do more to raise that because we're all dependent. All of us in higher education are dependent on great teachers in the K-12 system. Absolutely.
So, John, this was all very inspiring, especially the scholarship program. How does that scale up? I mean, it's great to produce 25 Stanford leaders that
Yeah.
presidents and senators. How does that translate to people who lead at different layers of society?
Yeah. So, admittedly, we're doing something that's for a very elite, highly promising group. It's not scale. Small private institutions are better at doing high-touch, smaller things than they are at trying to do big things at scale. I think you need both. I think, being perfectly honest, you need both. You need both kinds of institutions in the world. You need the institutions that complement one another. Not only the great research universities like Stony Brook, but you also need the institutions that are producing people from four-year degrees, because not everybody out there is going to have a master's or PhD.
How do you create leaders for different levels of society?
Yeah. So I think you can think some about purposeful. I'm a believer that in the end, leadership is two parts. It's learning something about basic skills and abilities, much of which you learn from other leaders, or at least from the biographies of other leaders. And the rest is experience. You can have great mentors that can help guide you through that process. But there's no way, I found there's no way that, I told you the story about having to stand up and tell people that we were laying them off. I was in my presidency just a short time when 9/11 happened. And you get called to stand up and say something on behalf of the community. After 9/11, and being a native New Yorker, it was close to I knew some people who had lost family members in the tragedy. You have to, at that point, the community's calling you to stand up and say something that will help them deal with the grief. So you learn from that first experience. I learned to get up there. And then, of course, I turned to Abraham Lincoln, my favorite guy in the world, and pulled something out of one of his speeches to bring everybody back into focus. So I think that experience thing, we're not going to craft it for anybody. People have to find their own road through it. But we can give them some tools along the way to help them learn how to do better at it. And I think we also, one of the things we did at Stanford in the last few years of my presidency was we created an ethics requirement for all our undergraduates. So they had to take a course focused on ethical decision-making and reasoning with things. Why do we do this? We're not seeking to replace whatever they learned from their parents and learned growing up through their church or their parents. What we were trying to do was to take real-world problems, let them reason through, and determine where their ethical standards were on a real-world problem before they were facing that problem in real time. If you read the story of the Enron guys, certainly one of the greatest corporate tragedies that ever occurred, they never took one big step that was all of a sudden from white to black. They took a lot of little gray steps. until the next thing they knew, they're sliding down the side of the mountain. And what started out as a little snowball is an avalanche. And what we've tried to teach the students is recognize that you're sliding down the side of the mountain before you compromise yourself in a way you can't recover. And that's the kind of lesson we want to try to teach our students, both in our program as well as on our undergraduates.
Dr. Hennessy, you referenced Raj Chetty's study
Yeah.
earlier, and I found that study to be really inspiring, and it's one of the main reasons why I came to work here at Stony Brook. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, he looked at the proportion of students at universities across the country that came from the bottom 20%, and then what proportion of them ended up in the top 20% by the time they were in their early to mid-30s. And Stony Brook was ranked number 3
Yeah.
in the country on that measure. What I'm really curious about is, when I reflect on the data that came out of that Equality of Opportunity project for private research universities, especially highly selected ones, most of them perform relatively dismally.
Well, they perform well, but they have a very small number of low-income students, right? Their low-income students do just as well as their high-income students, but they have a much smaller number. Yes. Right.
Recognizing and acknowledging that there are some pressures there related to, for example, U.S. News & Report, there's a finite number of low-income students with very high SAT scores. How big of a challenge, maybe not at Stanford, but as you think about your peers at other universities around the country, kind of balancing those two things?
No, it's a really big issue. I think we don't do enough. In fact, those students don't even apply. That's the fundamental problem, is that despite the change in financial aid, which increased the number of low-income students that applied, probably by roughly 50%, but we needed to increase it by a factor of 3, really, or 4, to begin to reflect what the demographics in the U.S. look like. So we started a few other pilot programs to try to conquer that. After Carolyn Hawksby, my colleague in economics, wrote a paper about the so-called undermatching problem, that highly qualified low-income students tend to choose schools where they are much better prepared academically and capable than the average student in the school. So instead of going to Stony Brook or Berkeley or Michigan or Stanford or Yale, they go to the local four-year college. The local four-year college, unfortunately, has a 50% graduation rate and maybe even lower for low-income students. And they don't have the opportunity, they don't have the support structure, they don't have the teachers that they really should have if they're a high-achieving student. So after Carolyn published that paper, I got together with a group of other university leaders, and she had proposed an intervention. What she proposed was getting the PSAT scores of high-achieving students. And it turns out if you have somebody's zip code, you actually have a pretty good guess on what their family income is, which says something about our country, something else about our country, how geographically segregated we are in socioeconomic status anyway. So you find low-income students with high-achieving PSAT scores. You would prepare for them a set of colored pages from 6 different schools saying, students with your kind of academic ability go to schools like this, and here's how much financial aid they get, so that they could really think about applying. Because if we can't get them to apply, then we've got a real problem on our hands. So that's gotten some improvement, but it's a more complicated problem. Lower income students often don't want to stray as far from home. They often are the most financially stable and capable person in their family, because even at the high school level, they may be better educated than their parents, actually. So I think we need to do more to make that bridge. There are things like QuestBridge and other things that have made some progress. But I think as a country, and you're absolutely right, that the private institutions with resources need to do a better job on that, because they haven't done their fair share. I agree with that.
So I think you had some really visionary ideas with respect to how to address this structural inequality with respect to income and providing general access to education. But specifically in STEM fields, right, we have this other structural inequality, which is the gender gap. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how to even sort of create the type of environment where we can begin to minimize this. Because it seems like we're losing a lot of opportunities in the field.
I agree. I mean, we can't afford to only have a select group of all males coming into the demand in the computer technology fields, information technology now so large that if we don't mobilize our entire population, we're not going to have the best technology in the world. So we've made some progress on this after a long. I mean, computer science many years ago when I was an undergraduate looked like it was going to be the engineering discipline that was different, that had more women in it. And then the field grew by leaps and bounds, but it grew almost all male. And remember, this is the era of video games. How you killed a lot of creatures, and that made you a budding computer scientist. It wasn't a good way, and I think it alienated a lot of young women because that wasn't what excited them about the field. The new era with social media and other things coming front and center has at least encouraged more participation. We put a really strong effort on recruiting women. I think the things that made the biggest difference were creating really good support groups so they didn't feel so isolated in the discipline. The other thing that worked really well is our introductory programming courses, we break the students into small sections, 8 to 12 students per section, led by an undergraduate who has already taken the first 2 introductory programming courses, a course to prepare to lead that course, and we made sure that half the section leaders were women. Marissa Mayer, who was at Google and then went on to be the CEO of Yahoo, came through that program. That made a really big difference in terms of getting the dropout rate in first-level courses dropped to 0, essentially. Women stayed in. And that's the big problem. I mean, you look at engineering enrollments generally. The problem is women start out interested. They used to have to overcome a lot of issues from damage done by middle school and high school teachers who didn't necessarily think that women should be in those. But now that problem's largely subsided. I think it's gotten much better. But we were still losing them in the introductory courses. So a little more support, hands-on, encouragement, feeling that there was a community of women in the field has really made a difference. So today, computer science is the largest major for women at Stanford. Single one major. And that took a lot of effort over a lot of years, but we finally punched through the numbers, and it's still not gender equal, but it's like 35% women. So that's been a big, big change.
Other questions?
Renee. Yeah.
It's not the teachers, and to some degree it is or isn't the children, but it's the children via the parents.
Yeah.
How do you get the people who are, let's say, not, how do you get them involved? How do you get them to get a better,
Yeah, it's a really hard problem, compounded by the fact that you can ask lots of parents about their kids' school, and their parents will say, oh, it's very good, even when their kids are not in a very good school. And we can show them the test scores and various other measures of learning. There's been some really great work recently by Shorten Reardon at Stanford, a bunch of people at Harvard, that look at something really interesting in how you evaluate schools. So one of the problems with evaluating schools is if you don't look at the socioeconomic makeup of the school, you can't infer anything. Because a school in a poor neighborhood, how do you possibly expect those kids are going to have test scores that compare to a local school here in Stony Brook, right? They're just not. It's just not going to happen. The level of parent education is completely different. The level of income is different. So they began to shape a different way of looking at schools, which is, given the socioeconomic status of these kids, does the school improve their outcomes, or does it lower their outcomes? And there are schools in the country where kids fall behind every single year. Not advance, but actually fall behind the rest of the cohort. And there are other schools where kids are advancing at slightly faster rates. So obviously you want your kid in one of those schools. And finding those schools is what you need to do. Anybody read Hillbilly Elegy? It's an interesting book. You should read the book. This is by a guy who's a partner of Peter Thiel, who's Trump's informal technology advisor and a venture capitalist, one of the founders of PayPal. But this is his partner, and he talks about what's happening in the Midwest and the elimination of jobs that required low skills and paid $60,000 a year with healthy pension benefits, and the disruption that's causing to those communities, and an unwillingness by people to move. Because the right thing for them is to move, or at least get their kids to move to. I think we're going to have to do more about the middle of the country. I think we're going to have to do more about investing in there. We're going to have to do more about trying to get companies to move headquarters in there. They have one big advantage that California and most of New York doesn't have. They have cheap housing. So there are some advantages. We've just got to figure out how to get jobs there. And if we can get jobs there, if we can grow opportunities for people, in jobs that are going to be continuing, not trying to roll back what's happened with manufacturing. That's not going to work very well. But in new sectors, then I think we could really make a difference, and we could inspire those people to pay more attention to school and the importance of school for them getting ahead. One of the most amazing things, I've met families from around the world, from poor areas in Egypt or in India or in China. The one thing I've observed about parents, every parent, their highest priority is that their kids have a better life than they have. And that's the one thing, if you can get that, to get parents to focus on that and get them the information they need, then I think they'll pay better attention to the schools and the quality of opportunity that their kids have.
I think this is a perfect point to end this. So I would like to take the opportunity to thank John again.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.